For 24 years, Judge Eleanor Whitmore ruled her courtroom with an iron fist, silencing attorneys and destroying lives, especially black defendants. But today, the system she controlled is about to turn against her. Stay tuned. The Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, had seen its fair share of controversial cases. But for the past 24 years, one name had loomed over the judicial system like a shadow: Judge Eleanor Whitmore. She wasn't just a judge. She was an institution, a force so deeply ingrained in the legal system that few dared to challenge her. With sharp, piercing blue eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a controlled, icy tone, Whitmore had perfected the art of authority. She never needed to yell to assert dominance. A mere glance over her reading glasses was enough to silence an attorney mid-sentence. But beneath that veneer of professionalism lay something far more sinister. A woman who had built her career on corruption, racism, and absolute control. Everyone in the courthouse knew the unspoken rule. If your case landed in Judge Whitmore's courtroom, the verdict was already decided. The rulings that spoke for themselves. For decades, Whitmore had mastered the subtle art of injustice. No one could prove she was biased, but the patterns were undeniable. Defendants of color, especially black men, faced harsher sentences, longer prison terms, fewer appeals granted, and virtually no chance at a fair trial. White defendants, particularly those with wealth and influence, received leniency, probation instead of prison time, dismissed charges, or evidence conveniently overlooked. Black attorneys, no matter how experienced, were routinely disrespected in her courtroom, their objections waved away, their arguments dismissed before they were even fully stated. Whitmore had a habit of leaning back in her chair, adjusting her glasses just so, and smirking as she denied motion after motion. She wasn't merely running a courtroom, she was orchestrating a performance, one where she was always the star and justice was just a prop. The fear she commanded. Even those who knew what was happening wouldn't speak out. Lawyers, public defenders, even fellow judges. It didn't matter. No one wanted to risk being the next casualty of Whitmore's wrath. She had the connections, the influence, and the reputation for ending careers with a single ruling. She controlled the courtroom, but her power extended beyond those four walls. She had deep ties to prosecutors, often coaching them through cases behind closed doors. She accepted bribes from defense attorneys representing wealthy white clients, ensuring favorable outcomes. She silenced whistleblowers, making sure anyone who questioned her authority quickly regretted it. But even the most powerful figures have blind spots, and Judge Whitmore's arrogance would become her downfall. A system built on fear. Until one man refused to bow judge, Whitmore had ruled without consequence for over 2 decades, shattering lives without remorse. She believed she was untouchable, but what she didn't know was that a man was watching, waiting, and preparing. David Carter, a seasoned defense attorney, had spent years tracking her corruption, her rulings, her every move. He wasn't just fighting for his client. He was fighting to expose the woman who had turned justice into her personal game. And on this particular day, in this particular courtroom, Judge Eleanor Whitmore was about to face something she had never encountered before: accountability. The heavy doors of the Jefferson County Courthouse swung open, and David Carter stepped inside. His polished black shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate, each movement filled with purpose. The air was thick, not from the Alabama heat outside, but from something more oppressive: the silent weight of systemic injustice that had lingered in this courthouse for decades. Carter had been here before, too many times, standing before Judge Eleanor Whitmore, watching as she crushed attorneys beneath her unyielding rulings. He had witnessed good men sent away for crimes they didn't commit, seen black defendants receive sentences 3 times longer than their white counterparts, and watched as public defenders barely got a word in before their motions were denied without a second thought. But today was different. Today, Carter wasn't just here to defend his client. He was here to expose a corrupt system that had gone unchecked for 24 years. A career built on fighting injustice. David Carter wasn't just any defense attorney. At 48 years old, he had built a reputation as a relentless fighter, a man who took on the cases that others were too afraid to touch. He had represented the wrongly accused, defended those the system had discarded, and challenged powerful institutions that thrived on the suffering of the marginalized. But nothing compared to this. His latest client, Marcus Reynolds, was facing armed robbery charges, a case that reeked of fabricated evidence and a rigged prosecution. Carter had seen this play out too many times before. The pattern was obvious. A black man accused with flimsy evidence, based solely on a witness who thought they saw him. A white prosecutor eager to secure a conviction, regardless of the truth. And of course, Judge Eleanor Whitmore presiding over the case, ensuring the trial was nothing more than a formality before she handed down her signature brand of injustice. But what they didn't know, what Whitmore didn't expect, was that Carter had spent years preparing for this battle. The man who knew too much, David Carter, wasn't just fighting for his client's freedom. He was here to expose the decades of corruption that had poisoned Whitmore's courtroom. For years, he had been gathering evidence, records of her rulings showing clear racial disparities, whistleblower testimonies from former clerks who had seen her manipulate cases behind the scenes, financial documents linking her to backdoor deals and questionable transactions. Carter knew that walking into this courtroom meant stepping onto a battlefield. He wasn't naive. He knew exactly what Whitmore was capable of. She had made careers disappear. She had ruined lives with a single stroke of her pen, and she would not go down without a fight. A calculated entrance. As Carter made his way to the defense table, he could feel her eyes on him. Judge Whitmore sat on her high bench, peering over the top of her reading glasses, her lips pursed in thinly veiled contempt. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice smooth yet condescending, "I assume you're here to waste the court's time today?" A lesser attorney might have flinched, might have stumbled over his words, knowing what kind of power sat behind that bench. But David Carter was not that kind of attorney. He set his briefcase down carefully, unbuttoned his suit jacket, and met her gaze without hesitation. "Not at all, Your Honor," he replied, his voice even. "I'm here to make sure this trial is conducted fairly. I assume you have no objection to that?" A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even the jury, many of whom had likely never seen anyone challenge Whitmore so directly, shifted in their seats. The judge's lips tightened. "Watch yourself, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone clipped. "You're already on thin ice in my courtroom." Carter simply smiled. "That's funny, I thought this was the people's courtroom." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Whitmore's face. Not anger, not irritation, but something closer to unease. She didn't know it yet, but this trial would be unlike any she had presided over before. Because David Carter wasn't just here to argue a case. He was here to take her down. The Jefferson County Courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, stood tall and imposing, its marble walls worn down by decades of trials, most of them already decided before they even began. But inside, one courtroom was different. It wasn't just a place where justice was served. It was a place where justice was controlled, manipulated, and in many cases, denied altogether. Judge Eleanor Whitmore had ruled from her high bench for 24 years, and in that time, her courtroom had become a spectacle of unchecked power. It was her stage, and everyone who entered played their part, whether they knew it or not. The unwritten rules of Whitmore's courtroom. Anyone who had practiced law in Jefferson County knew how things worked under Judge Whitmore. There were unwritten rules, ones that no one dared to say out loud, but that were understood by every attorney who had stood before her bench. If you were a prosecutor, especially a white one, your job was easy. Present your case, fumble through arguments if you had to, and Whitmore would guide you with thinly veiled coaching, ensuring you never lost in her courtroom. If you were a defense attorney, especially a black one, you had an uphill battle. Your motions were denied before they were even fully stated. Your objections were dismissed with a wave of her hand, and your clients were treated as guilty the moment they walked in the door. If you were a black defendant, you weren't fighting for a fair trial, you were fighting for survival. The outcome of your case had nothing to do with the law, and everything to do with whether Whitmore decided you were deserving of mercy. And mercy was not something she gave freely. Whitmore was careful, too careful. She never outright stated her bias. Instead, she let her rulings, her demeanor, and her subtle manipulations speak for her. She would let prosecutors introduce evidence that had never been disclosed. She would cut off defense attorneys mid-sentence, claiming they were being disruptive. She would allow unreliable witnesses to testify, but silence anyone who spoke in defense of the accused. And if any defense attorney dared to push back, she would tighten her grip. Threats of contempt, warnings of sanctions, courtroom humiliation. It was a performance, and Whitmore was the undisputed star. David Carter faces the show trial. David Carter had seen his share of corrupt judges, but none were as blatant as Whitmore. As the trial began, he sat quietly at the defense table, listening, watching. He could feel the tension in the room, a weight pressing down on every word spoken. The prosecutor, Richard Callahan, was young, overconfident, and entirely unqualified for the case. But that didn't matter. Whitmore had already decided he would win. When Callahan fumbled with his opening statement, Whitmore stepped in to help. "What the prosecution means to say," she interrupted smoothly, "is that the defendant's presence at the scene of the crime is not in dispute, correct?" Callahan, catching the lifeline, nodded quickly. "Yes, Your Honor, exactly." Carter clenched his jaw. This wasn't a trial. This was a scripted play, with Whitmore directing the performance in front of an audience that had no choice but to watch. Then came the so-called evidence. Callahan presented security footage, grainy, unclear, a shadowy figure barely recognizable. But before Carter could even object, Whitmore was already overruling him. "We will allow it. The jury can determine for themselves what they see." Carter's hands tightened around his pen. The jury wasn't supposed to determine anything. Whitmore was making sure the decision was already made for them. The defense is silenced. When it was Carter's turn to cross-examine the witness, Whitmore's control became even more obvious. "Mr. Thomas," Carter began, approaching the stand, "you claim to have seen my client at the store that night. Can you describe him?" The witness hesitated. I think he was maybe 6 feet tall, dark skin." Carter raised an eyebrow. His client, Marcus Reynolds, was 5 feet 8 inches, and his skin tone was lighter than the man in the video. "So you aren't certain then?" Carter pressed. Before the witness could respond, Whitmore cut in. "Move on, Mr. Carter. We're not here for trick questions." Carter turned to face her directly, a calculated pause, a deliberate stare. "I just want to ensure we get the facts straight, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Or does the truth not matter in this courtroom?" A chill settled over the room. The jury shifted. Even Callahan, the prosecutor, glanced at Whitmore with uncertainty. Whitmore's face remained stone cold. "Watch yourself, Mr. Carter. You're testing my patience." Carter exhaled slowly. She was feeling the pressure. Good. Let her feel it. A moment of weakness. The courtroom felt different now. Whitmore could sense it. She wasn't losing control. Not yet. But something was shifting. Carter could see it in the way she tapped her fingers against her desk. the way she adjusted her glasses too many times. She knew what he was doing. He wasn't just defending his client, he was exposing her. And for the first time in 24 years, Whitmore wasn't sure if she would be able to stop him. The trial wasn't just about Marcus Reynolds' innocence anymore. It was about Whitmore's corruption being dragged into the light, and she wasn't ready for what was coming next. David Carter had faced corrupt judges before, but Judge Eleanor Whitmore was in a league of her own. She ruled her courtroom with an iron grip, making sure every trial played out exactly how she wanted. She didn't just bend the law, she controlled it. But David had a plan. He knew that exposing Whitmore's corruption wasn't about arguing with her. It was about letting her destroy herself. The trap was set. David didn't fight every ruling. He didn't raise his voice or challenge her directly, not yet. He knew that people like Whitmore thrived on power trips. If he let her feel like she was in control, she would go too far. And that was exactly what he needed. So when the prosecution introduced unreliable testimony, David objected, calmly, precisely by the book. Your Honor, this testimony is speculative at best. The witness cannot positively identify my client. Whitmore barely let him finish. Overruled. David nodded and sat back down, making sure the jury saw everything. Then when the prosecution introduced evidence that had never been disclosed, David stood again. Your Honor, the defense was not given this evidence in discovery. That's a Brady violation. I move for an immediate mistrial. Whitmore scoffed, adjusting her glasses. Denied, Mr. Carter, and don't waste this court's time with baseless motions. Again, David let it slide, but the jury noticed. The courtroom noticed. Each time Whitmore cut him off, dismissed his concerns, or shut down a fair legal argument, David made sure to react just enough, not with anger, but with deliberate disappointment. A slight shake of the head, a slow exhale, a glance toward the jury as if to say, "You see this, don't you?" And they did. Whitmore's ego takes over. By the time David started his cross-examination, Whitmore was already on edge. She had ruled against him so many times that she had stopped even pretending to be neutral. She had become reckless. David stood, buttoning his jacket. Mr. Thomas, you testified that you saw my client at the scene of the crime, but you also admitted you're not entirely sure. Isn't that correct? The witness hesitated. I think I saw him. Yeah. David tilted his head. You think? Before the witness could answer, Whitmore cut in. Move on, Mr. Carter. David didn't react immediately. He took his time, just long enough for the jury to realize what had just happened. Then he spoke. Your Honor, I simply want the witness to clarify his own statement. Whitmore's face twitched with irritation. I said move on. David leaned on the podium, his tone measured. So for the record, Your Honor, you are preventing this witness from confirming whether or not he is certain about his testimony? The jury shifted in their seats. The court reporter's pen scratched faster against the notepad. The air was thick with tension. Whitmore knew she had gone too far, but she wasn't about to back down. Watch yourself, Mr. Carter. David smiled slightly. I always do, Your Honor. The turning point. From that moment on, the trial was no longer just about Marcus Reynolds' innocence. It was about Whitmore's corruption being exposed, live in front of a courtroom full of people. She kept making mistake after mistake, interrupting him when she shouldn't, ruling against him with no legal basis, coaching the prosecution in a way that was so blatant even the jury couldn't ignore it anymore. David didn't have to convince anyone. Whitmore was doing that all on her own. And soon it would all come crashing down. The tension inside Judge Eleanor Whitmore's courtroom was already thick, but no one expected what happened next. The trial was reaching its breaking point. David Carter had carefully built his case, allowing Whitmore to expose herself at every turn. She had overruled key objections, dismissed critical evidence, and interrupted him at every opportunity. But now the courtroom was on edge, not just because of the case, but because something felt off. And then it happened. The doors swing open. The heavy double doors of the courtroom swung open, the loud creak cutting through the air like a knife. Two federal agents in dark suits walked in, their movements precise, authoritative. All eyes turned toward them. The jury shifted, the gallery whispered, and even the court reporter's pen hesitated mid-scratch. But the person most affected was Judge Whitmore. She looked up from her bench, her expression immediately shifting from irritation to thinly veiled panic. "What is the meaning of this?" Whitmore's voice carried the same authority she had used for decades, but there was something different now, a slight tremor beneath the surface. One of the agents, a tall man with a sharp gaze, stepped forward, flashing a federal badge. "Judge Eleanor Whitmore," he said firmly, "we need to speak with you immediately." The courtroom falls silent. For the first time in over 20 years, Judge Whitmore wasn't in control of her own courtroom. She scoffed, trying to mask her unease. "I am in the middle of a trial. If you need to discuss something with me, you'll have to wait." The second agent stepped forward, his voice calm but unyielding. "I'm afraid this cannot wait, Your Honor." At the prosecution table, Philip Calloway, the young assistant district attorney, visibly tensed. Even he could sense something was very wrong. David Carter sat still, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He didn't react, not outwardly, but inside he knew exactly what was happening. Whitmore had ruled from her high seat of power for decades, believing herself untouchable, but she had finally gone too far. The arrest that no one saw coming. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, her glare sharpening. "I refuse to allow this courtroom to be disrupted. Either state your business or remove yourselves." The first agent pulled a folded document from his inside pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "We have a warrant for your arrest." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The jury members sat frozen, their eyes darting between Whitmore and the federal agents. The gallery erupted into murmurs, people leaning forward in their seats, whispering to one another in disbelief. The second agent stepped closer, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Judge Whitmore, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial corruption, and multiple violations of civil rights law. Please step down from the bench." The moment of reckoning. For the first time in decades, Judge Eleanor Whitmore wasn't the one giving orders. She stared at the agents, her fingers tightening around her gavel, as if she could will them away. But there was no escaping this. David Carter slowly stood up. He turned toward the jury, then toward the courtroom full of reporters, attorneys, and spectators. Finally, he looked up at Whitmore and said, "Your Honor, I believe you just denied my motion for a mistrial, but it seems this trial is now the least of your concerns." Whitmore's face drained of color. One of the federal agents reached for his cuffs. "Judge, we need you to stand." She didn't move. For the first time in her career, she was the one on trial. The courtroom wasn't just watching. They were witnessing a reckoning. For over 2 decades, Judge Eleanor Whitmore ruled her courtroom like a dictator, deciding the fates of thousands with a biased iron grip. Defense attorneys, especially black attorneys, knew exactly what they were up against when they entered her courtroom. Cases were rigged, objections ignored, and rulings heavily skewed in favor of the prosecution. But now, in front of a packed courtroom, the tyrant had finally fallen. The courtroom in shock. The federal agents moved toward the judge's bench, their presence authoritative and undeniable. The moment their words, "Judge Whitmore, you are under arrest," rang through the room, the entire courtroom froze. The jury sat in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. The gallery erupted into hushed murmurs, the air thick with shock and satisfaction. Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had spent his entire career under Whitmore's protection, looked pale and visibly shaken. His once confident posture crumbled, realizing his greatest ally had just been taken down. David Carter, who had spent years fighting against Whitmore's corruption, sat still. He had anticipated this moment, worked tirelessly behind the scenes to expose her abuse of power. Now he was finally witnessing justice unfold. Whitmore, however, wasn't ready to accept her fate. Whitmore's last attempt at control. "This is outrageous," she spat, her voice laced with rage and disbelief. "You have no right to do this." The lead agent didn't flinch. He simply held up a stack of documents, official court records, witness statements, and financial transactions. The evidence was undeniable. "Judge Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we have documentation proving years of judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, and racial discrimination in your courtroom. You abused your power, accepted bribes, and knowingly sent innocent people to prison. The system you manipulated to serve your own interests has finally caught up to you." Whitmore's face twisted in fury. She slammed her gavel down one final time, as if trying to assert control, but it was too late. Power had shifted, and she was no longer in charge. David Carter speaks. David stood up, adjusting his tie, and addressed the courtroom. His voice was steady, filled with quiet triumph. "For years, we have watched injustice thrive in this very room. The law was twisted, bent to serve the powerful while crushing the innocent. But today is proof that even those who believe they are untouchable will one day face the consequences of their actions." A ripple of agreement swept through the gallery. The jury members exchanged glances, now realizing the trial they had been sitting through had never been fair to begin with. Tyrone Willis, David's client, the man who had been falsely accused and nearly sent to prison under Whitmore's corrupt rulings, watched in silent awe. For the first time in years, he felt hope. "Sigwana for him." The agents finally moved in, placing handcuffs around Whitmore's wrists. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut echoed through the room, a sharp contrast to the years of wrongful rulings she had delivered without a second thought. The door to the courtroom, which she had walked through as the most feared judge in the county, now became the same door through which she left as a disgraced criminal. As the agents let her out, a hush fell over the room. The judge who had ruled through fear had finally met justice. The era of Judge Eleanor Whitmore was over. For years, the judicial system had failed Malcolm Reeves. His freedom had been stolen, not by evidence, not by truth, but by a corrupt judge who had decided his fate before the trial even began. Judge Eleanor Whitmore had seen his case not as an opportunity for justice, but as just another statistic, another black man to be thrown into the system without a second thought. But today, in the very same courtroom where Whitmore had silenced defense attorneys, dismissed evidence, and orchestrated convictions, Malcolm sat waiting to hear the words he never thought would come. The air was thick with anticipation as the newly assigned judge, Justice Robert Sinclair, took his seat. Unlike Whitmore, Sinclair had no ties to her corruption, no interest in protecting a broken system. He had been brought in to do what Whitmore never had: deliver justice. The moment of truth. David Carter, the defense attorney who had fought relentlessly to free Malcolm, stood up. His voice was clear, unwavering. "Your Honor, in light of the recent arrest of Judge Whitmore and the overwhelming evidence proving a pattern of judicial misconduct, we move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against my client, Malcolm Reeves." The courtroom held its breath. Across the room, Philip Calloway, the young prosecutor who had once stood proudly under Whitmore's rule, now sat with his head down, silent. The arrogance, the certainty he once carried, was gone. Judge Sinclair adjusted his glasses, then looked toward Malcolm. His gaze was firm, but unlike Whitmore's, it held no malice, no hidden agenda. Mr. Reeves, he began, his voice steady, I have reviewed your case. I have reviewed the rulings made by my predecessor, and I have reviewed the evidence that was deliberately ignored in this courtroom. The facts are clear. Justice was not served in your trial. It was manipulated, controlled by forces outside of the law. The gallery was silent, but the energy in the room was electric. Then Judge Sinclair took a deep breath and delivered the words Malcolm had waited years to hear. All charges against you are hereby dismissed. You are free to go. A moment of liberation. For a moment, Malcolm didn't move. His hands, which had been clenched together in his lap, slowly relaxed. His eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. Free. The word felt unreal. The bailiff stepped forward, unlocking the handcuffs that had been a constant weight on his wrists. The metal hit the table with a soft clang, and at that moment, Malcolm finally exhaled. A murmur spread through the gallery, a mix of disbelief, relief, and quiet victory. Some shook their heads in anger, realizing how easily Malcolm's life could have been destroyed. Others nodded, acknowledging that justice, though delayed, had finally arrived. A new beginning. David turned to Malcolm, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. It's over, he said, his voice steady but filled with meaning. You walk out of here as a free man. Malcolm swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. He had spent years believing this moment would never come. Now as he stood, stepping away from the defendant's table, without shackles, without judgment, without fear, he knew one thing for certain. For the first time in a long time, he had his life back. For years, Brandon Calloway had thrived under the corrupt reign of Judge Eleanor Whitmore. He had been the rising star in the district attorney's office, the young prosecutor who never lost a case, not because he was the most talented, but because he had the system rigged in his favor. He had learned quickly that justice had nothing to do with the outcomes in Whitmore's courtroom. Power did, and for as long as he played by her rules, he had it. But today, everything had crumbled. The fall of a golden boy. As Malcolm Reeves walked free, the world Brandon Calloway had built collapsed around him. He sat frozen at the prosecution table, his face pale, his fingers gripping the edge of his notes so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The confidence he once carried, the smug assurance that had made him untouchable, was gone. His safety net had vanished the moment federal agents took Judge Whitmore away in handcuffs. And now all eyes were on him. The gallery, once filled with whispers of fear in Whitmore's courtroom, now buzzed with something different. Judgment. People who once watched in silence as Calloway railroaded defendants were now staring at him, watching as he squirmed in his own discomfort. Judge Robert Sinclair, the new judge assigned to replace Whitmore, had turned his gaze toward him. Unlike Whitmore, Sinclair wasn't there to protect him. His expression was unreadable, his posture calm, but there was a weight behind his eyes that told Calloway one thing. His time was up. A reckoning in the courtroom. David Carter, the defense attorney who had just dismantled Whitmore's corrupt empire, slowly turned toward Calloway. There was no arrogance in his stare, no gloating, just cold, undeniable truth. Mr. Calloway, David said, his voice measured, I think it's time you answer for your role in all of this. Calloway stiffened. I was just doing my job. His voice wavered, a stark contrast to the self-assured prosecutor he had been only hours ago. David took a step closer. Your job? He scoffed, shaking his head. You helped put innocent men behind bars. You stood in this courtroom time and time again, knowing the scales were tipped in your favor. You silenced the truth, and you called that justice? The room was dead silent. Judge Sinclair leaned forward, his voice low but firm. Mr. Calloway, do you have anything to say for yourself? For the first time in his career, Brandon Calloway had no words. He had spent years standing beside a woman who abused her power without fear of consequence, believing she was unstoppable, and by extension, so was he. But now as he sat under the weight of his own complicity, he realized that the shield Whitmore had provided was gone, and without it, he was nothing. The end of a career. By the time the courtroom emptied, Calloway remained in his chair, staring down at the legal pad in front of him, his mind blank. He had once been a prosecutor with a promising future, an unshakable career, a name whispered in political circles as a man destined for power. Now he was ruined, because in the end, the system he had helped corrupt had finally turned on him. The courtroom was emptying, but David Carter remained standing near the defense table, watching as Malcolm Reeves took his first steps as a free man. The weight of victory should have felt satisfying, but deep down, he knew this was just one battle in a much bigger war. Judge Eleanor Whitmore was gone, dragged away in handcuffs, and Brandon Calloway's career was in ruins. But David knew that for every corrupt judge exposed, for every prosecutor caught stacking the deck, there were countless others still hiding in the system, protected, emboldened, and waiting for their turn to abuse their power. Malcolm turned back to him, his voice quiet but firm. "What happens now?" David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Now?" He let his gaze sweep across the now silent courtroom, the very room where so many innocent men had lost their freedom under Whitmore's gavel. "Now we keep fighting." This wasn't the end. This wasn't even close to the end. Because as long as men like Malcolm were being falsely imprisoned, as long as people like Whitmore and Calloway were allowed to manipulate the system, David Carter's job would never be done. With one final glance at the judge's bench, now empty, stripped of the tyranny that once controlled it, David picked up his briefcase, squared his shoulders, and walked out. Because justice wasn't a single moment, it was a war, and he was ready for the next battle. This isn't just a courtroom drama, it's a harsh reality for too many people trapped in a broken system. Corrupt judges, biased prosecutors, and rigged trials aren't just fiction. They happen every day. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, if it made you think, then don't just watch, take action. Stand up against racial injustice, demand accountability, and fight for real change. Share this story, speak out, stay informed. Because justice only happens when we refuse to stay silent. This story is more than just a courtroom battle. It's a harsh reflection of racial injustice in the American legal system. Judge Eleanor Whitmore used her power to silence and oppress, proving how corruption thrives when no one dares to challenge it. But David Carter refused to back down. His fight reminds us that justice isn't given, it's taken, and that powerful systems can be exposed and dismantled when the truth is pursued relentlessly. The lesson? Racism and corruption persist when we stay silent. Speak up, demand accountability, because justice should never be a privilege. It must be a right for all. Like, comment, and subscribe. The fight isn't over.